All right, welcome those that are here. You made it through the fog. We're glad you're here. We're going to go ahead and begin our prayer service with a song. We're going to be in 540, I Run to Christ. If you want the hymn book in front of you, I'll have the words on screen. I've been reading through the Gospel of Mark, and you know how you read through the Gospels and intentionally there's just kind of section that dovetails with section that dovetails with section. So eventually got to this verse. This is after Jesus sent out the 12 to go and to cast out and to heal and to preach the gospel of the kingdom. They get back and Jesus looks at them and they're so busy. The text says they don't even have time to eat. And so Jesus says, come on away, guys. Let's go and rest for a while. And they get in the boat and they cross the sea and crowds follow them. So instead of getting to rest, now they've got tens of thousands, probably 5,000 men plus women and children, and Jesus teaches them, and then he feeds them. And then immediately after he feeds them, because his hour has not yet come, he puts his disciples on a boat and says, row to the other side. And then in Mark, it says Jesus goes up into a high place onto the mountain to pray, and he prays all night. And it's almost the idea is while he's praying, he can see his disciples out in the middle of the sea rowing for their lives against the wind. So they're exhausted, I think is the point. They're literally exhausted, strained to their limit. And Jesus doesn't go rescue them right away. He lets them row for like a good chunk of time. He lets them row and then he walks out on the water. And the text says he meant to pass them by, but they see him and they get all afraid, think he's a ghost. And our Savior sees them with compassion. And verse 50 says, because they all saw him and were terrified, immediately he spoke with them and said, have courage, it is I, don't be afraid. I don't know what you're going through this week, but Jesus, your great high priest, is near. He's close by. So whatever you are going through, his words are as true for you tonight as they were those many, many years ago. Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. And of course, he gets into the boat with them and the wind ceased. And they were completely astounded. And that's what Jesus can do. So let's draw near to Christ, and a good song that will encourage us to do that is number 540, I Run to Christ. So let's sing, I run to Christ when chased by fear and find a refuge sure. Let's sing this hymn together. I run to Christ when chased by fear and find a refuge sure. Believe in me, his voice I hear, his words and wounds secure. I run to Christ when torn by grief and find abundant peace. I too had tears, he gently speaks, thus joy and sorrow meet. I run to Christ when worn by life and find my soul refreshed. Come unto me, he calls through strife, fatigue gives way to rest. I run to Christ when vexed by hell and find a mighty arm. The devil flees, the scriptures tell, he roars but cannot harm. I run to Christ when stalked by sin and find a sure escape. I cry to him, temptation yields to grace. I run to Christ when plagued by shame, and find my one defense. I bore God's wrath, he pleads my case, my advocate and friend. Amen. Pastor Stevens.
Well, good evening, everyone. We will be in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 tonight. There are outlines on the back if you didn't get one and would like to have one. I wish I could do this whole session in one segment, but there's no way we're going to get through all this in 20 minutes. It would take at least 45. So we'll just review as we go along, take maybe 2 or 3 weeks. In beginning, let me ask you this question. What would you say was Israel's biggest failure? We're talking Old Testament. What would you say was Israel's biggest failure?
Idolatry.
I'm hearing.
Idolatry?
And Tom, you. Idolatry? That's really, really close to what I want us to say. Really close. If you looked at the outline, you probably could guess it real quick. Maybe not. What's the root word? What's the root meaning of the word holiness? Set apart.
Intermarriage.
That would be the extreme of it, yes. And
Well, that they were not separate culturally.
there it is. A lack of separation. What do you suppose is the greatest reason for the digression of God's people today? Anyone? Same thing. This is so critical. So with the last 3 or 4 sessions, we've been talking about God's holiness and holiness in Trinity. And what my plan is after we study the attribute, then we will follow up with how that attribute ought to affect our lives. Because God is holy, he tells us what? Be ye holy. And there are lots of places we could go to in the Bible, but I think that 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 7:1 really summarizes it quite well. And so that's what we'll be looking at tonight. You could choose from many texts which demonstrate a proper response to God's holiness. Exodus, Leviticus make it clear what God commands and what God forbids. Holiness is separation, and so that's what this text talks about. These verses give us a very good understanding of the Bible's concept of separation. So we're looking, first of all, at what I call the coveted condition. You know my fondness for alliteration. Bear with me. It helps me organize my thoughts. And we're looking at the status we prefer. So looking at 5 different things: fellowship, communion, concord, part, and agreement. And this is all from the King James. I did this whole series in the King James, and it'd be really difficult to change the whole thing over to ESV, so bear with me on that as well. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, what fellowship, in the middle of the verse there, what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? So that's the first word that we're looking at, is fellowship. And these the Greek meaning of these words is really, I think is really interesting. And this text says it so well. So if you looked up fellowship in a Greek lexicon, you would read something like this: partnership, or having things together in common, a bond of union, or sympathy. And let's just concentrate on this one, having things together in common, because that's pretty close to what the word that's translated fellowship here means. It's partnership, it's having things together in common. We'll see the good of that later, but for now we're just defining these 5 words. The second one is communion, also in verse 14, what communion hath light with darkness. And that word means the state in which what is true in one is true in another. Or it could be described this way, the state in which the inward experience of one is shared with another. So having things together in common, what's true of one is true in another, experience of one is shared with another. Concord, verse 15. The Greek word there is symphonesis. Symphonesis. What English word does that sound like? Symphony. And that's exactly right. Andrea, would you go up in the piano and give us some chords that just sound terrible? Oh, yeah, well, yeah, I could do that too, but I couldn't do the second part. Ugh. Okay, everybody's, set your teeth. Now a chord that sounds just lovely. Thank you. First one, set your teeth on edge. The second one, just wow. And that's basically what the word is referring to. It literally means to sound together or to be in harmony, and that's primarily used in instruments. But it also can be translated as the absence of discord caused by disagreement. I realize we're taking this all apart. We'll have to put it together later, but I think this is the best way to organize it, at least in my diseased mind. The fourth word is part, in the last part of verse 15 there. And that means an assigned portion or a share, or something mutually profitable. And then finally in verse 16, the word is agreement. And that means to sit down together in approval, accord, alliance, to consent to, or to vote for. So having things together in common, a bond of union or sympathy, the state in which one is true as one is true in the other, the inward experience of one is shared with another, to be in harmony, the absence of discord caused by disagreement, something mutually profitable, and to sit down together in approval. Now, all of us crave these meaningful kinds of relationships. So we're looking secondly, B, at the situations which pertain. And you tell me, what kind of situation, is that the right word? You might guess what I'm fishing for here. To what kind of alliances would that apply?
Relationships?
Yes, what kind of relationships, thank you, would that apply? What kind? Marriage would be number one. I think that would stand out in everybody's mind. That probably would be the very first thing that a person reading this text would come up with. So what other kinds of relationships, however, might this refer to? Church, yes. Yeah, absolutely. So in my outline, number one is our life's partner. Number two is our church. What other kind of relationships might that apply to?
Business dealings?
That's number three. Business partners. I believe that that's very much the kind of thing that the Bible's talking about here, to go into business with an unbeliever. And there would be at least one other. And this is maybe not as obvious as the other three. Close friends. Close friends. Now, we need to have unsaved friends, don't we? And if we don't, heaven help us, because that's one of the reasons why the Lord leaves us here. But we do not cooperate in their worldly lifestyle. We befriend them for one main reason. That's because we care about their souls, and we want to have opportunity to share our faith with them. And then any kind of bond that we form with others. And I think I can speak this pretty much with everybody, except for maybe the hermit. We actively seek people we can bond with in this way. I am so thankful that God put my wife and I together. As much as it's possible for a man and a woman to think alike, we definitely share the foundational truths right down the line. And I'm sure all of you would agree with that in your marriages as well. We crave that kind of bond. We actively seek people we can bond with in this way. And what kind of people become your closest friends, your greatest friends? Yes, absolutely. So, those who don't want that kind of bond are usually those who have been hurt over and over and over and avoid opening themselves up for further hurt. But even those kind of people, I'm sure deep down would really want to have that kind of relationship. We want to be able to bond. God made us that way. He made us that way. We are a brother's keeper. Iron is to sharpen iron. We're to be able to share these bonds together. And so C is the source we pursue. With whom will we seek this bond? And so, secondly, we're looking at the colossal contrasts.
What was the source we will seek?
Which one?
The slide just before that. One slide.
You have to talk loud. I can't hear well.
Source we pursue is what she's looking for. C.
Yeah, the source we pursue. So the colossal contrast, first of all, our actions. In verse 14, what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? Or literally, lawlessness. So here is the first colossal contrast. Conformity to God's law, or opposition to God's law, or very simply, right or wrong. And then our attitudes, light and darkness. What does light represent in the Bible? Righteousness? Purity? And in Ephesians, it is a descriptive word for the way we ought to live our lives, walk in the light as he is in the light. So, light is one who knows and walks in God's truth. Darkness is just the opposite, obviously, one who is ignorant of or rejects God's truth. Third contrast, our allegiances. In verse 15, Christ and Belial. Now, this word Belial, when we think Belial, what do we automatically think? Who's it referring to? Satan. Originally, that word meant something that was worthless or in hopeless ruin, and it could also take the meaning of extreme wickedness and destruction, and then eventually it became a title or a name for Satan. So one who is worthless and hopeless ruin, extreme wickedness and destruction, or Christ, the Holy One of God. Could you get a more colossal contrast than those two? They do not harmonize So therefore, how can his followers? Because if we're not in Christ, 1 Corinthians 15, we're in Adam. We're still the natural man. And how can there be communion between the followers of Belial and the followers of Christ? D is our adherences. Verse 15, believers and infidels. Well, an infidel is just simply an unbeliever. So let's think that through. Will the unbeliever share in your belief? Maybe in some very basic things. But let's think of it about another way. Would you share in his unbelief? Doesn't this make you feel sorry for people when they just so blatantly disregard their position before God, their responsibility? They just go their merry ways and think nothing about it. So will he share in your belief, or will you share in his unbelief? No, colossal contrast. And then E, our adoration, God's temple and idols. God's temple is a building consecrated to God, and it is no place for idols. Anybody know of any churches that have idols in them? How can a Christian mingle with the people and the things of the world? What really important things do they see eye to eye? So, with whom will we seek this bond of fellowship, communion, concord, agreement, and part? And I may just get through this tonight. That's because I'm going quickly. Maybe, maybe not. Number 3 is the clear commands. First of all, there must be an estrangement. Verse 14, be not unequally yoked together. Does anybody know what that's a basic reference to in the Old Testament? Ox and donkey. Why were they not to be yoked together? Anybody have any idea?
Work together.
Yeah, it'd be complete disharmony. It just plain old would not work. So a yoke serves to couple two things together. The word unequally literally means heterogeneously, or one of a different kind. And the reference is to Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 10, yoking a donkey and an ox together. So it refers to an intimate cooperation, a cooperative relationship of any kind. An intimate cooperative relationship, say that 10 times real fast, of any kind. So saved and unsaved form an unequal yoke. You end up pulling the wagon of the unsaved one's unbelief. There must be an estrangement. B, there must be an exit. Very simply, come out from among them. I mean, how hard is that to understand? C, an exclusion in verse 17. Be separate. And that's that root meaning of the word holiness, right? This word, separate, means to mark off from others by boundaries or to exclude, to refuse to be involved in close relationships. And finally, D, there must be an evasion in verse 17, touch not the unclean. So avoid contact with that which is impure. In the Old Testament, Jews were rendered unclean by touching certain things. And what did they have to do until they could rejoin the rest of the people? Anna?
They had to wash, cleanse themselves.
Yeah, there were various different ceremonial cleansings before they could then return back into their homes with everybody else. So they were excluded, though, until they were cleansed. So it's pretty clear, isn't it? Be unwilling to touch what is physically unclean. Leave alone what is morally unclean. So I am going to have to stop there, but I'll give you Roman numeral 4. That's the concluding covenant. And so here we're going to put it all together. And so, Lord willing, next week, I do still have one more Wednesday, right? 31st?
Okay.
So next week, Lord willing, we'll review this and then put the final piece in the puzzle. And I think you'll be blessed, as I am, by how complete of a picture this presents of what it means to live a holy life. Comments, questions? Okay, good. I only have one prayer request tonight, and that is for our annual meeting coming up Sunday for unity and decisions. Pastor, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would like to come up and say a few things.
Okay.